Hey, friend. Welcome to Red Hot Mindset. I am so glad you are tuning in today. Okay, I really felt drawn to begin taking some of the deeper and more controversial topics and talking about them on the podcast. I felt like I was hesitant to do it in the beginning because I didn't want to offend anyone or ruffle any feathers, but I've realized we need to take a stand and have these tough conversations. I also felt God calling me to it, and I know He'll be there with me through it. So, you're going to get some of this from me as we move forward. Tough love, tough conversations. I may even bring some people on the podcast that I don't agree with so we can bring back healthy debate and prove that we can disagree and still get along. I think that is something that is so missing right now in this culture. Today is a hot topic for many, and I know it's controversial in nature, but it needs to be talked about because it is affecting our kids and the generations to come. Why? Because it's seeping sneakily and not so sneakily into our schools. Critical race theory. What is critical race theory? It is the ideology that is behind most of the diversity inclusivity trainings in the school and the workplace. And these trainings are actually counterproductive because they're leading to more bias and fear. It is a lens through which to see the world, a worldview. It shapes how you view politics, theology, and education. Critical theory sees everything as the oppressed versus the oppressor. It is deconstructing those constructs until they get down to fitting into this worldview of the oppressed versus the oppressor. So, why does this matter? What's the big deal if our kids are being taught it in schools? Isn't inclusivity and diversity training a good thing? That's exactly what I have Andrew Rappaport on with me today to talk about. The language in our culture is changing, and we need to be aware of what the truth is behind it all. Andrew Rappaport is the preaching pastor of Grace and Truth Bible Church in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. And he is also the founder and executive director of Striving for Eternity Ministries and the Christian podcast community. He is the host of several podcasts: Andrew Rappaport's Rap Report, Andrew Rappaport's Daily Rap Report, Apologetics Live, and So You Want to Be a Podcaster. He has a full schedule. Andrew grew up in a Jewish home and became a Christian at the age of 16. He holds a master's degree in theological studies, magna cum laude from Calvary Baptist Theological Seminary, and a BS degree from Monmouth University in computer science. He and his bride live in Pennsylvania and have 2 adult children. All right. Are you ready to step into the fire today? Because that's exactly what we're about to do. Hi, Andrew. Thank you so much for hopping on Red Hot Mindset with me today. I'm really excited to get to chat with you.
Well, I'm glad to be here. I think you and I talked a long, long time ago when you were just starting on podcasting and looking to get into that. So it's good to see how well you've grown and how podcast has been doing.
Yes. And that was so helpful for me. I'm one of those people who it takes me a while to make decisions now. I used to be good at it, but it takes me a while. So I'm like, okay, I need it perfect. I need it, and you were the encourager for me to say, just do it, because you can always change things as you go. Your message needs to get out there. And so that's been an encouragement for me. And I've appreciated that time that I got to spend with you as I was really newbie at this and still feel like a newbie, but it's been so fun. And I'm excited to dive into our topic today because I think it's going to be really good and something that we need to hear. But before we dive in, I'd love for you just to share a little bit about yourself so that we can get to know you better.
Sure. I've been a Christian for more years than I'm going to admit, because no matter how many, whatever my age, my wife's only 29. So I got to make sure that works in. She just turned 29 because we've been married 26 years. So I had to up her age a little,
I love it.
It's getting hard. It's getting hard. I grew up in a Jewish household, bar mitzvahed. My family has gone really all from Orthodox Jewish all the way to practicing atheist within one generation. And so I became a Christian at the age of 16. was so bold, I told absolutely nobody for 2 years, knowing that if my parents found out, they would bury an empty casket, which when I was 18, they found out and they were casket shopping. So they had every intention of burying an empty casket and I would be dead to them. But the Lord called me into ministry. I've pastored a Chinese church, which everyone goes, how does a Jewish guy end up pastoring a Chinese church? My wife is from Hong Kong. That usually explains it for folks. And so, and then I started a ministry called Striving for Eternity, which is, we say that we train people for eternity. We're a discipleship ministry, but we're a little different because we actually focus on small churches. Our goal is to help small churches that most ministries ignore. But the majority of churches are under 25 people. They don't have the resources. They don't have the ability to have speakers come in and train them. And so that's what we do. We focus on those type of churches. We come in, they can't afford us. Our monthly donors support us to be able to come in, give them training, give them kind of a kick to get started with discipleship and training folks to really grow their churches and to be more on a sound footing. I'm also one of the other ways I decided to disciple, which is what brought you and I together, was we started at a Striving for Eternity. We started the Christian podcast community, and so we disciple podcasters, and so we host a bunch of podcasts. We've reached over 2 million downloads on those that are hosted with us, and so we do a lot of different things, but it's all around discipling and training for eternity.
I love that. What great ministries. And the fact that you don't need this huge, large church, or we don't need to grow to thousands and thousands. I can affect this many, and I can affect this section here or this group of podcasters. And I think that's something that we just need to be, is kingdom minded. And what can I do to affect eternity in all that I do? It doesn't matter how many people listen to my podcast. It matters that the people who need to listen to it, right? And that God uses it. So today
let me give an
Yeah.
illustration that your audience would understand. People think about running a marathon, and marathons don't get run the day of the marathon. Marathons are run in the training, in the 4 months of training up to the date of the marathon. That's where you do it. And so most people think of, let me get this big platform. Let me focus on that big event. The reality is it's all the small events. It's all the small training that no one sees that makes up for any big event that happens. And those big events won't ever happen if you don't do the training up front. And so that's where we focus. Don't focus on numbers. Don't focus on the one individual you're making an impact with, because that has an eternal impact. And that's the important thing.
I love that. Anytime we can bring it back to running, it so resonates with me. And Andrew is a runner himself too. So I love that we have that connection as well. Today, we're diving deep into critical race theory, something that is being talked about a lot more, but I think it needs to be talked about even more, especially in the Christian realm with a biblical worldview. Because, and I'm going to have you talk a little bit about what critical race theory is, but from my understanding of it, is it's really a worldview. That's what it is. And it sees everything as oppressed versus the oppressor. And it kind of deconstructs all the way down until everything gets fitted into that worldview. And with that, it means it shapes how you view politics. It shapes how you view theology or how you view education. It shapes how you view other people. And it actually, the name itself maybe sounds, okay, it's fine, it's not a big deal. But when you dive deep into it and you really get to know what it is and how prevalent it really is in our society, it's actually a danger to us. And it's something that we need to be aware of. And we need to know how to stand against it. So can you maybe add or articulate a little bit more about what critical race theory is?
Sure. Let me start with a definition of what social justice is, because this is where it comes from. And there's a lot of terms we're going to have to talk about. We're going to have to define for folks. And I think the reason people are starting to talk about this is actually because just before Trump got out of office, he finally recognized the danger of critical race theory and said, okay, that's it. We're not going to be having this in any federal training. This has been something that's been slipping into businesses and all. And as we go through these definitions, some of you who work at like a Fortune 500 company, you're going to see this stuff and go, wait a minute, my company's forcing us to learn this stuff. Well, this is where this has been. It has been forced, and people didn't recognize it. It's under the name of diversity. When you get diversity training, that's actually what we're going to be talking about. Now, some diversity training is just, hey, let's all recognize each other are equal in the starting line of a race. I'm going to use that illustration throughout, because this really becomes a difference that we're going to see between what's called equality and equity. You'll hear President Biden speak about equity. The thing, though, that we recognize is that the church has been dealing with this longer. So social justice is a concept that is used to describe a movement towards a socially just world. But what they really mean is cultural Marxism. It's a utopia-based society where there is equality of wealth, income, social justice. There's no need for a ruling government. It's an impossible goal. But that is the underlying argument. As Christians, we're going to argue, yes, we believe in justice. And this is where this has been a battleground within the Christian church, because it's like, well, are you not against justice as a Christian? Of course I am. The issue is when you add the word social to it, because that's different than biblical justice. And so social justice is the idea that everyone should have equal. And this is where there's a difference between equality and so when we speak of equality, what that means, if you think about a race, we would say everybody starts the race at an equal starting line. That is equality. Equity is everyone finishes at the same time. That's impossible. I mean, I think about when Joe Biden says we should have equality. Okay, then all of us should be president. He should not be upset that all of us would be that is all of us getting to the finish line at the same time. That's when they speak about it. That's really what it comes down to, is we, at the end, everyone should get equal. Everyone should get equal pay, equal everything. Of course, that never works, because those in power always end up taking for themselves. This is a system that has historically, we can go through history, Mao in China, most recent that we saw that Barack Obama said he wanted to model after is Venezuela with Chavez. And you look at it now, it was a great economy, and now people are fighting on the streets for food. This is what happens when social justice comes in, is they end up coming in, bringing Marxism, and the people who fight for it, who say they're oppressed, become the people that actually realize what real oppression is, because those in power only use them to get more power and cut out anyone that would be in opposition to them. Now, in America, they've had a really, really hard time bringing this in. Why? Because when you look at these other countries like China, like Cuba, like Russia, like Venezuela, everywhere where this Marxism has come in, they've been able to basically criticize the idea of the wealthy class versus the working class. America didn't have that. That was the whole American experiment. If people don't know their history, that's what makes America different, is we were built where everybody starts at the same part of that starting line. And now it's up to you to get as far as you can get. There's nothing that limits you. There's no nobility class or anything like that stops you from achieving to the maximum you are capable or desiring. You might be capable of more, but you just don't want to work hard. Okay, you don't go as far. That's your choice. And that's the way America has worked. And so they have made a lot of attempts. What they ended up doing was what started really in Black liberation theology. I know I'm going a little bit long on history, but it becomes important. Black liberation theology started in the 60s. Dr. Cohn is the most known for it. He basically lays out arguments where he is going to say that this is like whites just don't realize they're racist. They're racist and they don't recognize that. Everything is based on the fact that there's a societal racism. And this is what ends up becoming into critical race theory. Now, I'm going to properly define this or properly label this as critical racism theory, because that's what it is. It is racism. What it does is it is the idea that everything is based on race. So there's an oppressed class. Blacks in America are supposedly oppressed. Now, I'm saying supposedly for a reason. Why? Because when you read Dr. Cohn, what you're going to see is he's still fighting in the 60s. He's still fighting that blacks are treated as subhuman. Blacks are not allowed to vote, yet they were. He started in the 60s, but he's writing even into the 70s. Blacks were allowed to vote then. The issues they're fighting for are issues that have already been resolved. They're fighting against segregation, but that's been stopped. Yet they're still fighting those issues. And so what you end up seeing is critical race theory is, and I might refer to that as CTR, or critical racism theory. What you see with it is the idea that they actually are the racists. They see race in everything. So if you are white and you say you're not racist, that just shows that it is systemic, so systemic with you, you don't even recognize you're a racist. They've redefined the word racism, where racism historically has been defined that this is, you have people who are looking at another group of people, showing prejudice toward them because of the color of their skin or some characteristics they have. As I said, my wife is Asian, so she's going to have an Asian look to her. You're grouping people by the way they look. Now, biblically, there's only one human race, so there is no races. Scientifically, okay, the greatest difference between us genetically is 0.092%. We're not very different, okay? There is no race other than the human race. Now, biblically, there's the unsaved and the saved race, and that's about it. So when we look at racism, we see that it is changed in a definition where nowadays people that are black will say they can't be racist because they're oppressed. And as you mentioned, this is the key with this, is the idea of oppression. Everyone in your audience listening to us right now, think about your childhood. You can find a time that you've been oppressed by someone. I grew up Jewish in a very Catholic neighborhood. We would have all kinds of things that would, where we would be basically marked out because we were one of the few Jewish families in the neighborhood. We would be, I would go to school, I'd be picked on. Was that oppression? Sure. But what do you do about that? How do my parents train me with that? Well, they train me to, okay, this is part of life. Let it make you be stronger, overcome that, just be smarter than them, get better grades in school than them, get a better job than them. Don't let them hold you back. That's not what CRT teaches. What it teaches is you should throw your hands up in the air and depend upon government to take from others who worked hard to give to you because somehow it's unfair. Okay, so with that leads us into one last term I want to use in this part is intersectionality. This is something you're going to hear a lot as well. And intersectionality is this idea that you have disadvantaged groups, and each of those disadvantaged groups, they exist, and those groups of people that are, whether it is the color of skin, we are seeing it with gender, people that are, say, well, I might be biologically a male, but I'm really a female, nationality, disability, sexuality, all these different things. If you're a Black person, you get one intersectionality point. You're Black woman, you get 2. You're a Black woman who's a lesbian, you get 3. That's the idea of this, is saying that if the more intersectionality points you have, the more right you have to speak on the issue of being oppressed. And so that's why you're seeing in this last political election, they're all trying to argue for how they're more oppressed than each other, at least in the Democrat Party. They're all trying to show that they're more of a oppressed class than each other. The reality, and I do find it funny that what did they end up voting for? The old white guy, the very thing they're trying to say they don't want. I'm just saying, they criticized the Republicans because the Republicans had Trump, an old white guy. And what did they go with? An old white guy. When they had all they had blacks and homosexuals and everything, but, they ended up ignoring all that. So these are the terms we'll talk: social justice, critical racism theory, intersectionality. You're going to hear those terms. The term that all of them go toward, what all this is about, is a worldview known as Marxism. because that's what it drives toward.
Yeah. And I think it's good that we identified that right away and gave the definitions. And what I'm finding is interesting is society's changing definitions. And so a definition could sound good, but it's changing. So it doesn't mean the same as it used to. And I've learned I need to keep my old dictionary. So if you're listening to this, you need to have an old dictionary, because if you look up on Google a definition, say marriage, and then you look in the Webster's dictionary that you have at home, they're not going to say the same thing. And that's what it is. That's why we need to be clear on our terms before we get into this. And I don't know if you've noticed that, Andrew, but I've noticed that. I've kind of looked up some different words, and it's surprising and I think that's why, and they're trying to play on our language to make us feel bad or feel guilty that we aren't agreeing with them, because how can you not agree with justice? Well,
Yes.
Your definition is different than my definition, or the old definition, right? Or the biblical definition. So that's what's important. And another thing that is important to know is, and I'm sure Andrew's the same, we do not like racism. We hate racism. Does racism exist in America? Yes. But critical race theory is something completely different. It is a racist theory, and it is a worldview. And so that's what we're kind of hashing out today. And so, and like you said, when it comes to intersectionality, essentially I would have a point because I'm a woman. So I could speak to things women, right? But
No,
because
actually you wouldn't. No, you wouldn't. You're a Christian. And as a Christian, you lose all points. It doesn't matter.
That's true.
You're black, you lose all points as a Christian, because Christians are the ultimate oppressors in this system.
That is
talk
true.
about why that is later, but
yeah, we are going to get into that. We're going to talk about CRT and the church as well. But one thing I think is interesting, and this comes with like the changing of definitions, is that really when you listen, I don't watch the news, and I'm a broadcast journalist major. I loved being in the news, right? That is my thing. I hated the negativity of it, but I loved getting a good story. But it has been twisted. It's not the same as it used to be. And I don't want all that junk in my mind. But the media these days make you feel that if you aren't okay with what's going on, then you are a racist, or you are on the other side, because there's now sides, which is really ridiculous because there used to not be like that. But why is it that how can it be so twisted, and the media making it sound like a good thing? How do we change the language for ourselves to like know, okay, this is what they're saying, but that's not who we are. They're turning us into something that we're not.
You know, there was a book written in 1948 called 1984. Some of us had to read that in school. I'm sure that they do not have that as required reading anymore. But if you read that book, it's very interesting, because the main character, his job was to go through all the historical records when they changed definitions of words, and go through all the history to change everything. And the whole idea is those who control the past control the future. And that was the one thing when I read that book, I'm like, a lot of it I could go, yeah, I could see these things happening in the future. But that, I was like, we're never possibly going to get to where people can just change definitions and everyone would accept it. And now we go, well, look at what a boy and a girl are. I mean, these are biological terms. I mean, aren't we supposed to follow the science? Now, you could get in trouble for calling someone who is biologically male a female. Like if you don't call them a female and they identify as a female, you could get in trouble because definitions have completely changed, and they're changing rapidly, changing at a very quick basis. And so you read that book and you go, this is what this is about. The ability to control language, because what happens in this, what you're seeing right now, is anybody who is not in line with this is being called a racist. We had 4 years of Trump being called a racist. And I would ask people, what has he done to be a racist? Like, give me some of his policies. I mean, when you just look at the voting records, he got more black votes in the first election, his first election, than any other Republican. He doubled it in the second. How could that be if he's such a racist? Same with the Hispanic vote. What's going on? Well, the definition of racism is what changes. So that now, if you have money, then you're a racist, because It's no longer about prejudice against color of skin. Now what it's about is the fact that if people feel oppressed, I mean, you literally have guys in the NBA making millions, tens of millions of dollars, and they're sitting there going, "Well, we're not going to, pledge allegiance because the America is so racist, and we're so oppressed." And I'm looking at them going, "You're oppressed. I mean, if you really believe in this, you shouldn't be making tens of millions of dollars. You should be giving it away." This is the thing I always find amazing with the people that are pushing this. They're the least likely to give to charity. They give toward their agenda, but they don't give toward charity. If they gave as much money as they do toward this agenda to charity, maybe we would end some of the poverty. But the reality is there's a purposeful reason for what I'm going to refer to as a lack of integrity in language. Now, I use that term when it comes to defining cults, but it's the same measure. The reason for having a lack of integrity in language is because it keeps control on people. You're able to redefine things, twist things so that you're always in the right and everyone else is always in the wrong. That keeps you can always play the victim in this. You can always say that someone else is wrong. And what you're trying to do is get them to backpedal, to feel that they have to be defensive. And this is why when, as you had said, people say, "Well, aren't you against, you shouldn't be against justice, should you?" What does that immediately do to the person? "Oh, now I'm defensive." Well, the reality is, don't do that. Don't fall for that trick. When they say, "Well, you're not against justice, are you?" No, I'm not against justice. I'm all for God's righteous justice on earth. In fact, you can't know what justice is outside of the nature of God. What they want to do is remove God from this. But how do you know what justice is? What is just? We get that from an absolute universal standard, the nature of God. Once you remove God from the picture, now you have a standard that we can change. And if we could change the standard, then what we can easily do is change it to anything we want to get what we want today. This is the reason that go through history. I know they don't teach history in schools anymore, but if you actually study history, this is what ends up happening. Before Mao, Hitler, Lenin, Stalin, Chavez, all of them, what did you see? Propaganda. They end up putting out propaganda and then censoring so you can't have anything else. Well, CRT is being used to shut down any opposition. In fact, on my Rap Report podcast, I did a couple of weeks ago, I actually looked into a document that the Biden administration put out on their strategy on countering domestic terrorism. And you read through this on how to track and violent domestic terrorists, and we'd say, well, that's a good thing. But the reason, and it's a longer episode than I usually have. I usually do an hour. This was 2 hours. Why? I wanted to take time to go through this document because what they target is anybody who disagrees with them. If you think that the Democrats have an overarching, that with their government is overarching and overreaching, then you're a terrorist. If you're moving off of some social media platforms to something that's end-to-end encrypted so that your privacy is protected, you are assumed to be violent terrorist. If you think there was fraud in the 2020 election, you're a terrorist. If you think that you don't believe everything they're saying about COVID and the vaccines, you might become a violent terrorist. And therefore, they say they want to track before people get violent. And what they're doing is using CRT as the standard to define what is a person going to be a violent terrorist. And once they identify you, now they're saying, well, we have to disrupt their ability to make money or to recruit. And so churches, for example, they're saying that all churches are teaching white supremacy. And you go, wait, even the African-American churches? Yeah, even African-American churches are supposedly teaching white supremacy. That makes you the terrorist group in this document. And therefore, they're going to need to disrupt your ability to make money or recruit. Now, recruiting we would call evangelizing, right? So this is their target. They've laid it out. And, I end up going through that because it is very scary to see what is happening in this country. This country was based off freedoms, but you have right now a Democrat Party that, in my opinion, pulled off a coup. How did they do it? They said Trump was going to pull off a coup. And so they kept saying the other party's going to do what they're doing. They're right now arguing that because of January 6th, where there wasn't a single gun found and not a single one of the 500 people that have been arrested, not a single one of them is being charged with insurrection. Not one. But that was supposedly an insurrection that put our democracy at risk. And they say that the Republicans and conservatives are attacking democracy. And then you go and you look at Cuba and go, wait a minute. Here's where we see Marxism and communism. And what are the Democrats doing? They're supporting the communists. And it's the Republicans supporting the freedom fighters. Interesting. So who's really for democracy? Both parties say they're for democracy in America. One says that they're fighting for it in America, but they're fighting for communism in other countries. Because that's one of the things you end up having to see with propaganda campaigns is the words they say are meaningless. You have to go to what they're saying. You have to go to definitions. And that's why you're seeing right now is people are stepping up in the schools across this country right now. People are going to their school boards and fighting the teaching of CRT. And what are they all doing now? And all the Democrats are going, we're not teaching critical race theory. That's just in legal bounds. That's nothing we're teaching. No. Yes, you are. But what are they doing? They're going to redefine it. They're just going to change the name so that we're not teaching critical race theory. We're teaching something else. They're now trying to say we're just teaching history, a rewrite of history, right?
Yes.
This is how this game gets played.
Yeah, that's so true. And I have another interview coming up with somebody who is on a school board who's been fighting against it and sees it firsthand. Because honestly, and this is what we're going to talk about then, is it's infiltrated from the schools. And we're indoctrinating our children. I don't even like to use that word anymore because of the definition, different things and all that. But we're training our children in a Marxist way, and we don't even know it. And you know why? It's because we're not willing to get in there and fight. We're not willing to get in there and actually see what's going on and read what's being taught and see if history is being taught right. Because the thing about history is we want to learn the good and the bad. We want to remember the bad, because America is not all positive, right? There are bad things that happen in America, and we need to remember that. But there were bad things that happened throughout history, and we can learn from that. But if we erase it, then we are now redefining and changing the entirety of the country. And that's something that is super important and passionate for me because I have 3 young boys. Now, we've homeschooled our entire career so far. I have 2 that are moving into a charter school, but I bet you, I went in and I asked my questions. I said, are you teaching critical race theory? Are you teaching social emotional learning? What are you doing with math? Like, I had all my conversations. What are the bathrooms? And I said, I want to know who the history teacher is. I want to know who the English teacher is. I asked them what books they're reading, and I did my homework. And the reason I did that is because it's so important what our kids are learning. And it's interesting because people are like, oh, Marxism's not here. And I think people just don't understand what Marxism is. And that is actually the doorway right into communism. It's a stepping stone into it. And CRT is a stepping stone into Marxism. And I don't know if you can help me kind of define how does CRT play into it, and how is it kind of seeping into that Marxism? How are we seeing it now?
Well, CRT is the idea that there's an oppressed class and an oppressor class. This is no different than what Marxism will teach with there's a ruling class and a working class. There's in both, there's the haves and the have-nots. Both are where those that have are oppressing those who don't have. The idea of it is to get those who don't have to rise up because that's where the numbers are. That's where the masses are. Get them to rise up to fight those who have and take it away from them. So let's look at this in an example of China with Mao. Mao ends up saying, he comes in and says, it's not fair that you guys are all working on the farms and working the land, but you can't own it. You're not allowed to own it. The elite class can own it. You vote for me and I will take from the rich and I will give you the land. And so they're like, yeah, that's what we want. We want to be able to run our own lives. We want what they have. Not realizing that, not everybody is equipped to run a company. I would never want to be the CEO of a Fortune 500 company. I hate the politics of it. I would never want to do that. I wouldn't want to be a politician. It's just not the way I wouldn't find value in doing something like that. And so some people make choices of desire. Some just cannot physically be able to do certain jobs. And so what does Mao do? Mao says, I'm going to give you all the land. So he just takes it from the rich, gives it to the poor. Oh, everyone's happy, right? Well, no, because they couldn't take care of the land. So what happens? They're not producing. Now there's no rich people taking care of them, because what the way it was that those who own the land had the responsibility of caring for those who worked on the land. Well, now no one's taking care of them. Well, fights break out. What does he do? He says, well, we got to take care of this. We're taking away all the guns because those guns are going to kill people. Once they do that, guess what? Now there's no one to fight the government who has all the guns. So he says, okay, now we're going to have to, take all the land from all you people. We'll take it as a government, and we'll give you, you'll work it for us, and we'll pay you. What was that? That was a transfer of taking the land from the landowners to the government. Now the government had the land, the government had the control with the guns. There's certain things that they end up wanting. They want the media, they want the money, they want the meals, they want your health. These are the things the government controls. When they control that, they can then force you to do whatever they want. And so the way critical race theory ends up working in here is it works off the idea that there's an oppressed oppressor class. If we could just take from those nasty conservatives who seem to have everything, which is really interesting because right now the world's rich are all social justice warriors, but they ignore that. I mean, Bezos and Stephen Jobs and all these guys, they're not a conservative. They're not the Republican Party, right? Which is what everyone always thinks of as the party of the rich. Well, that's changed. The party of the rich is actually the Democrats now. The party of the working class is now the Republicans. There's been that shift. And so people don't recognize that shift happened. Why did that shift happen? Because they want to control. And that's how they use critical racism theory to control people. And you're seeing this, folks, think about your job. Think about when you go into work. Do you have the liberty to speak out against Black Lives Matter protests and riots? Do you feel that you could freely speak about your Christian views at work? Do you feel in the public square that if you were to speak against what we're calling CRT, the social justice, which Black Lives Matter is an example. And by the way, the organizers are trained Marxists by their own admission. And then what do you see they're doing with the money? They're not giving it to all these individual BLM states organizations are suing the national. Why? Because they can't get money. Oh, because all the founders are spending it for themselves. Where did they all spend it? They spent it on Joe Biden's election. In fact, before the election, if you went to the Antifa website and went to donate to them, you were forwarded right to Joe Biden election campaign. So you can't say that this is not tied one to another. They use this to get elected and to pull off a coup. And what we end up seeing is they're doing nothing for the people that they claim to be working for. And a lot of people are starting to wake up to that. But they're going to use this to get control. That's what it's all about.
Right. It's a strategy. That's exactly what they're doing. They know exactly what they're doing. And it's an attack on Christian America. It's an attack on values and morals and a free society. And because they want the control. And it is scary. I mean, because a lot of times they'll call us conspiracy theorists. Oh no, this isn't happening. That's not true. You're full of it, all those things. But when you really look at it and you see how it's the path it's going and the little steps that they're taking, you really do see that that's where we're headed if we don't do something about it. We are headed toward a Mao society, a Chinese communism. And some of the Democratic Party would be happy for that, which I don't understand, but it's true. So now I know that we're going to talk about this a little bit in the form of the Nazis in Germany, because I know you grew up Jewish and you were trained in Hebrew schools to identify the signs of another Holocaust. And I know that some of what you've seen there is you're kind of seeing here. And I'd love for you to share and expand a little bit on that, because I know some people, people have been harassed for saying this is Nazis coming into America, right? But the reason they're getting harassed is because no, we need to like shut them up, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah, it's interesting. You can call Trump a Nazi all day long, but you can't call those that are actually practicing the same thing Nazis did. You can't call that out. That's somehow wrong. It's amazing, the double standard.
mm,
So I grew up in Hebrew school. For folks that don't know, in Hebrew school, we'd go 3 times a week, and then on Sunday, we would learn Hebrew. But more than that, we would learn the Jewish tradition, the Jewish background. We would learn, being a generation after the Holocaust, we were trained to expect another Holocaust. We were being taught. And for years, I've had my Apologetics Live program where I would have atheists come in and I would talk about this, and they'd be like, you're just making things up. I was just speaking in a church in Ohio, and someone said, you were here 4 or 5 years ago, and you said there's going to be another Holocaust coming, but it won't be with the Jewish people. It's going to be with the Christians. Do you still believe that? My response was, have you seen the news lately? He was like, yeah, that's why I was thinking it. Like, you were really ahead of the time. The reality is that there's certain things you're going to see. One of the things that the Nazis did early on, they started their propaganda. They had, you may have heard of the Night of the Long Knives. The Night of the Long Knives was where you had a Jewish person, he killed a high-ranking Nazi. They end up having a time where they start then, and they planned, they made it sound like Kristallnacht, which was the night where they all went after the Jewish businesses. They made it sound like that was just something that just popped up, kind of a grassroots thing. No, it was in planning. There was actually 2 different people in the inner circle of Hitler's circle that were planning this out, the Jewish problem. Well, they had plans. They strategized how to do it. And when you get people that get in office like Hitler, based off blaming, in this case, the Jewish people, what you get in power with, you stay in power with. So Hitler had to keep ramping it up. I don't think he had plans when he first got into office of the concentration camps, but he was going to lose power if he doesn't keep this going, because then there might be infighting. The thing that was uniting his base was focused on one group of people they could blame. What did they blame? The Jewish people had money. So what did it become? Well, all the Jewish people had to be out of public office. They couldn't be teachers where they would teach the next generation. They couldn't be judges or lawyers where they can institute law. You're seeing that now in America with Christians. If you remember some time ago, Bernie Sanders was arguing that when they were before the Senate for, accepting someone for public office, this person as a Christian, he said, well, you because of your values, because you think you're wrong and you're right and the Muslims are wrong, you're not fit to serve in public office. Now, my answer to Bernie Sanders would be, but the Muslims think they're right and I'm wrong, right? Simple. We just use simple logic. But what they're doing is they want to get Christians out of any influence that will affect the next generation or be able to affect laws. They want Christians out of the public square. And so they want, and you're hearing this now, where the argument is for Christians to keep their Christianity in church, right? This is why they don't want churches to be able to gather and meet right now. You're seeing up in Canada where pastors are being arrested for having church. By the way, church, ecclesia, the Greek term we use, is by definition a gathering. It was originally a gathering of people for voting, but it's changed over time. In my book, What Do We Believe?, I define church as it has been more and more specific through the centuries. But church is a gathering of people for the worship of God. You cannot do church at home. You cannot do church on Zoom. Church, by definition, means to gather together. And so they want to put a stop to that. Their strategy on counterterrorism is to break up. It's going to be to break up churches. It's going to be to be able to stop. Why? Because just like in Nazi Germany, the reason they went after Christians as well as Jewish people is because we have an absolute standard of right and wrong. We're not accepting the definitional changes of things. And because we don't accept these definitional changes, we're going to, like you were saying, you're going to go back to a dictionary.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you got to go to an old dictionary. You go to the ones online, they're changing terms left and right. And so we're going to be saying, no, there is a standard that's absolute. It doesn't change with culture. Well, that goes against what everything they want to do. So what do they got to do? They got to silence those people. Is there no, I mean, like George Soros supposedly is funding the Southern Baptist Convention, which is starting to go woke. And you'll hear that term as well. When we speak of woke, it's the idea that people woke up to this critical racism theory. They woke up to the fact that they're a racist or they're being oppressed because of their race. And why would George Soros fund a Christian organization? Well, now you see why. He is pushing for Marxism. Someone who you would think, George Soros, who lived through the whole thing in Nazism with Germany. Oh, by the way, he was the Nazi. He was a Jewish guy that went with the Nazis to try to stay alive. You want to talk about the Nazi? Here he is, and he can fund all this stuff. Now, if you think about all the money George Soros has paid to push this worldview, if he would have just given that to people, that would have raised the bar of what poverty is. It wouldn't actually end poverty, because the reality is it's one of the things you're going to see with critical racism theory, just like with Nazism and all that we see with Marxism. It's an unachievable goal. We talk about critical racism theory. When does it end? Never. Because you can never stop apologizing for your racism being white. Now, my family, we've never owned slaves. We came from Russia and Romania. We never owned slaves. In fact, when you think about this, the idea is all whites are racist. And yet it was the whites in the North that fought for the freedom of the blacks in the South. And yet they were racists. Mm-hmm. Yet everything that the system is built on is supposedly racism. And so what they say is the whole structure has to be torn down and rebuilt. That's why they're tearing down the monuments. That's why they're tearing down anything that they could say. Even someone that fought for abolitionism of slavery, their statues were torn down because they represent racism. People who fought for the blacks to be freed. This is how it ends up being. So there's no reasoning with this. There's no end to this. The end goal is never going to be achieved until they have complete power. Now, those that are, pushing for like Black Lives Matter and this, they think that their end goal is going to be a black supremacy. That's never going to be achieved, because those whites that are actually in power, that are using, if you study the history, you'll know this term useful idiots, which is the term that was used for Marxism. It's the masses that are useful for those that want to get in power. They're useful to them because they're idiots, because they don't know much. They don't know what's really going on. And because of that, they can use them. Well, that's actually what's going on, is that they're using the blacks in America to with this Black Lives Matter to push to be the masses to fight for their control. And that's their end goal, is that they'll have complete control, and then everyone's silenced. Then in America, we'll all understand what real oppression is.
Yeah, that's interesting. And it's so true. And that is where we're headed if we don't do something about it. And I think sometimes we're like, who am I? I can't really do anything about it. But if we all think that way, nothing's going to get done. Right. And we need to be able to be willing to stand up and say, this isn't right, and do something to affect that change. I think this is a great place for us to segue into the dangers of CRT in the church, because like you were talking about the woke movement, and the woke movement really is seeping into the church. The church is falling for the social justice, because Jesus was all about justice. He fought for justice for sure. But so when you add anything like the social justice gospel or the prosperity gospel, when you add anything to the gospel, you're changing the gospel, right? And so there are definite dangers in the church. And what do you think that we need to be aware of?
Well, the idea of social justice, as it creeps into the church, redefines the gospel. And you say, Andrew, that is a huge step to make that claim. Yeah, but it's the reality. The gospel is the fact that every one of us have broken God's law. We are sinners. We are criminals in his sight. And as people who rightly deserve, because we're guilty, we rightly deserve eternity in a lake of fire as a just punishment because we violated a holy, infinite God who's holy he's infinitely holy. He's infinitely just. And because of that, there's an infinite consequence to breaking his law. We rightly deserve eternity in a lake of fire. That is, we have nothing to say, well, we deserve. We deserve nothing. That's the gospel. We deserve nothing, but 2 Corinthians 5:21, he who knew no sin became sin that we might become the righteousness of Christ. All of our sin was laid on Jesus Christ on the cross, that his righteousness is laid upon us. It's what Martin Luther called the great transaction. That's the gospel, that we, though deserving eternity in a lake of fire, get eternal life because of what Christ did. Because of what someone else did, we benefit. What social justice says is the complete reverse of that. It says, well, if I feel oppressed, even if you have never owned a slave, you're guilty of slavery. Even if your forefathers fought for the ending of slavery, you're guilty of slavery. You're guilty of sins that you didn't actually commit, but your forefathers did. Well, go far enough back and everybody can find that. By the way, many blacks were the slave traders that were kidnapping the people and selling them to the white slavers. So, when we can't just go by color of skin and say, well, that makes you guilty of slavery or free of it. And so the reality is it takes sins of other people and applies it onto people that are alive today. You're guilty of what your ancestors have done. And if you're the oppressed class, it's all about me getting my rights. Well, the gospel is about you saying, I have no rights. Complete opposite. So where the gospel is all about God and what he did, social justice is all about me and what you owe me. It's an entitlement. I deserve better. I want. If you have something, I deserve it. That's a complete opposite. And so this is what it ends up doing to the gospel. We ended up, I'm trying to think, this is probably back in 2015. This is, by the way, one of the times, it's the rare times that the church was ahead of the culture. The church was dealing with CRT before the culture was. CRT has been working its way in through our schools, into churches, and through our entire society. And it was the church that recognized it, because the church is the one that they have the crosshairs on. The church is the one that they have to silence and get out of the way for them to achieve their goals. And so back, I think in 2015, that 75 of us got together and we wrote a letter to John MacArthur because we had the idea of putting a statement out on social justice and the gospel. And we got together and we all signed this letter asking if he would get behind it. And when he saw the issues, he got behind this, and 19 of the initial 75 got together and put together what is now called a statement on social justice and the gospel. You could go to statementonsocialjustice.com if you want to sign. There are over 16,000 signatures on there now. And you'll see what we say we affirm and deny. And we put that out because we see that there are issues that we see where there is an attack of social justice on the gospel. It completely reverts it. It basically says culture becomes more important than scripture. So we should use culture to interpret the Bible and our theology, not use the Bible to interpret our theology. You end up having redefinition of all kinds of words because of this. Instead of right justice or equal justice or righteous justice, it's social justice. Intersectionality, is overlapping with classes. You have critical racism theory you end up seeing that they just call it now critical theory. You have all these things that end up changing. Things that we end up seeing, that you're seeing churches that where scripture's clear. Let me take a clear one. Homosexuality. Scripture is really clear on that. And you have a lot of churches that are trying to embrace those who practice homosexuality because this is what the culture is accepting. It's a complete reverse. So what ends up happening in that is people end up going against what Scripture says to fit in with the culture. This does not help. I understand that some think that, well, what this is this is, we're trying to be like the world so we can have an influence on the world. But you have to understand something. Just like those Jewish people that thought if they work with the Nazis, that they can get the Nazis to not do what they were doing. The reality is no. The Nazis went after some of the Jewish people and left some others out, but eventually they all got caught up in it. And that's what you end up seeing here. Those churches that are working with the social justice think that they're being Christ-like. I was just on another podcast where they asked me to talk about the idea of being Christ-like, because there's a progressive Christian, and she was saying we have to be Christ-like and not biblical. You see, and think about that. And what do you have? You have they're a clear example of what's going on within what's called progressive Christianity, where they want to redefine things. You can be Christ-like, but we shouldn't be biblical. Well, how do you know what it means to be Christ-like? From the Bible.
Right.
I mean, that's where you learn what it means to be like Christ. So there's no way to be Christ-like without being biblical. But what they mean by it is Christ-like is we define it from our vantage point, from our culture informs us what we think Christ would look like. And we redefine that. We don't look to the Bible. This is why it's very dangerous when you have people that are pushing, and some of them unbeknownst. There's a lot of churches when the Black Lives Matter riots occurred. And by the way, if you want a real insurrection, that's what happened up in these areas where you have Chop and Chaz, where they took over city blocks and said they are their separate country. That's the very definition of an insurrection. January 6th, where people were invited into the Capitol, we see the police officers waving them in. What that was a coup. Why do I say that? Very simple. What did they want to do? The Republicans wanted to have I forget, it was a 10 or 15 day across the states audit.
Yeah.
And just as they're about to propose that, they're stopped. And it's like, oh, there's a bomb scare. We got to get out of here. The bomb scare was in the RNC and DNC. It wasn't there. And then they had to move them around. And then they invite the people and say there was a riot. And it was violent because a woman was shot. There wasn't a single gun found. Okay. The woman was shot by a police officer. That's the only death that occurred. And they talk about it being violent. Well, they haven't released the officer's name, by the way, but she shouldn't have been shot. What do you end up having? That whole thing is being defined as an insurrection. But there are churches that are splitting. I spoke with pastors. I've been counseling pastor after pastor that are dealing with, as social justice is working their way in, they've had splits within their churches where a bunch of people said, well, you got to support, Pastor, you got to support Black Lives Matter. Well, the idea of Black Lives Matter sounds good because Black lives do matter.
Absolutely.
The unfortunate thing is that Black lives won't matter until all lives matter. I mean, Black babies that are in the womb, those lives have to start mattering. If we don't have a respect for all people, we're not going to have respect for any group of people. And I did a podcast on this on the Rap Report about that Black lives won't matter until all lives matter. You want to end racism? The only way to end racism is to end racism. Racism can never end by using racism to end it. And that's what CRT is. It's an attempt to use racism to end racism. That will never happen. What that'll actually do is you're going to see, I predict, you're going to see a rise of white supremacists. They're going to be upset with the way the Black supremacists are being allowed to get away with stuff. There's going to be a rise of that because people are going to get fed up, and that's going to vindicate the Black supremacists, say, see, they're going to use that. But what we end up seeing is that this whole thing is, it is a different gospel message. It is an attack and an affront to the church. And yes, Black lives do matter. Every life matters. Okay. But the organization Black Lives Matter is a Marxist organization that, even though they've changed their goals on the website because they were losing a lot of Black support because of it. And I did on Apologetics Live, we did several series on Black Lives Matter to show this. And we went through there. Their agenda was to end fathers in the home. They don't want fathers in the home. You go, wait a minute, isn't that one of the causes of the problems in the Black community? Is fatherlessness? Exactly. They want it to continue. They don't want fathers in the home. They want to put an end to the nuclear family. You know what they had in their goals is that single mothers shouldn't be having to work so that they can be out fighting for social justice. And you go, wait a minute, not taking care of their children. No, that's not the agenda. It's to fight for social justice. Wait a minute. I would think that a single mom, her focus, if you're not going to like keep her home so she doesn't have to worry about working, so she could care for her children, right? But that's not their goal. Their goal, and you look at their 13 points of their 13 goals. None of it was really about Black lives. It was about homosexuality. Was the major thing, pushing homosexuality, pushing an end of the nuclear family. These doing everything they can that would hurt the Black community. That's been the problem within the Black community. Why? Well, it keeps them getting money, ultimately.
Yeah, so true. And so when it comes to the church and critical race theory and all the things we were talking about, what do you do if you find it in your own church? What happens? Like how do we fight it in our own church? How do we identify it?
Well, there's a lot there. Okay. So
I know. Loaded question.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen churches where I mean, I'm talking dozens and dozens of churches where people are up and leaving and they're having church splits because the pastor won't support Black Lives Matter. They won't support wokeism. And that becomes very difficult. This is where you have churches that one day before everyone got along fine. Next day, everyone's an enemy. Okay. I had a young lady who she referred to me as her father. She would call me Pops. She was like an adopted daughter to us. She would travel with us everywhere we went. She worked for our ministry. But now she won't even talk to me. She's blocked me or removed me on Facebook and everything else. Why? Because I won't support Black Lives Matter. If you haven't figured out, she's Black. And so these are the type of relationships that are being severed within churches. And so what do we have to do with it? Well, one thing is, if these things are happening, we have to first communicate that there is a difference between the organization, the Marxist organization, and the not really the logo, but the line Black Lives Matter. Because what people think is when you are against the organization, then you're against Black lives. There's a difference there. So we have to be careful. One of the things I would say is within the church, people have to realize that for some people who have been raised to believe that they're being oppressed, or there is a tribalism here, and I'm seeing people that are being forced within their own communities. And what I mean by that is they're Black communities, homosexual communities, whichever it is, where they have to stay with the community. And in these cases, it's if you don't accept what they're saying, then you're part of the problem. You're the oppressor. That makes it really hard to work together in a church. And so one of the things to do is to define our terms. And one thing to do is to understand why people feel the way they do. I have someone that the husband of someone that I went to church with. Her husband is a Black Lives Matter supporter. He's a social justice warrior. In fact, he's got a podcast on NPR on social justice. Now, we get along and we talk. We have very differing views. But one of the things he'll do is he'll say, I can't understand social justice and I can't understand this stuff because I'm white. I'm not oppressed. And what he's learned is I quickly say, well, I'm sorry, but you don't understand what it's like growing up Jewish. You don't understand the oppression that I had. And he's had to back off of that and realize, well, no, I honestly, I don't know that. You see, all of us have an oppression. We've all can find some way that we feel that we've been oppressed in our background. So what we need to do is to recognize that we all have that. We can all sense that we have felt oppressed. Why? Because there's sin in this world. That's where that oppression comes from. And so defining terms is very, very important. Listening to one another is very, very important. Now, I'm not saying you have to agree with one another. With this individual who I just referred to, he and I do not agree. We know very clearly we disagree. We have long discussions that can sometimes get somewhat heated, a lot of emotion in them sometimes, a lot of us wanting to understand each other, though. And that's the one thing I love about him, different than others. He's not monolithic. He actually thinks through things, and he'll concede points. Like he conceded that the organization Black Lives Matter is not helpful for the Black community, even though everything he wears says Black Lives Matter on it. He's focused on that slogan, Black Lives Matter, not the organization. But I say you can't separate those two, because when that's what is pushing it. So we have to get people to understand that difference, though. There is a difference between the organization and the slogan. There's a difference between fighting for biblical justice and social justice. So we need to educate people. We need to train people so that they understand these things. We need to properly interpret Scripture. One of the examples that is used the most when it comes to this is Zacchaeus. And so here you have Zacchaeus. And what does he do? He recognizes that he oppressed people, took their money, and so he pays them back 4 times. The argument people make is, see, so whites should have to pay back blacks 4 times as much. Well, here's the difference. Zacchaeus did that voluntarily. Nobody made him do that. He chose to do that out of a desire that he recognized that he could do. Now, obviously, he had enough money that he had invested or whatever from the money that he took from people that he could pay 4 times as much from what he what he took above and beyond what he should have from them. So he must have had other resources, and he used that to pay back. But he did that voluntarily. That's the difference. What we have is where they want the government to come in and take from the rich and give to the poor. Okay. One of the things that we have to also recognize is I refer to Robin Hood. Many people know the story of Robin Hood, and they know it incorrectly. They know the Marxist view of Robin Hood and not the true view of Robin Hood. So let me explain those, because when we explain these things to people, it helps people. We know of Robin Hood that he stole from the rich and gave to the poor, because there were so many poor and they were oppressed and they couldn't take care of themselves. So Robin Hood took from those mean, nasty rich people and gave that to the poor. And then the poor lived happily ever after. That's Marxism. The historical Robin Hood, basically what was going on was the government was so overtaxing people that people didn't have money. That's why they were poor. He didn't steal from the rich. He stole from the government. He stole from those who were stealing from the people, who were taking too much taxes from the people and giving the people back their hard-earned money.
Right.
That's not Marxism. That's capitalism. Okay. And so Robin Hood becomes a great example of the two different dynamics that we end up seeing here. We have them both. You have the redefinition of Robin Hood. And so we need to educate people. We need to recognize that those who know Christ, we may disagree here on earth. We're going to spend eternity together. Get that view right now. Understand that this is your brother in Christ. You disagree with them. There's a disagreement. You work together to solve it. You don't run away. You don't keep quiet on it. You don't silence yourself because it's against the cultural view, and you don't let them oppress you by saying you have to accept their view. But at the same time, you have to help educate the weaker brother to recognize what the issues are. And so we need to work through churches. It's one of the reasons that Striving for Eternity, we do these weekend seminars. Okay, we come into churches and we have a lot of different weekend seminars on how to interpret the Bible or evangelism or apologetics. And one of the ones we've done recently that we've added is one on social justice, giving a history of social justice, explaining to the church how to combat this within the church, how to deal with these issues. It's become one of the more popular ones because people are having to deal with it. So we come into churches and train, right? That's part of the thing. And the one reason why we do this is because for the pastor to stand up and start training, when you have people on two sides and they're divided over this, the pastor is in a no-win situation. One or both sides are going to hate him for being the bad guy. So we come in and we're the bad guy. Okay, we come in, we do the educating, we try to give people a groundwork, and it does cause a stir. But what it does is it allows the pastor to now say, okay, let's think about what the striving fraternity said in their seminar. What are the definitions we have here? And he's the guy that's now coming to support those two groups and bring them together. And so that becomes one thing that how we're trying to combat that for churches, to say, here's how, we'll come in and be the bad guy in explaining what these things are. And for a lot of people, they've never heard this stuff. And so it's eye-opening for them. And so most pastors don't study this to the level where they can give this history. And so that's why we go through this. We take the time, and instead of trying to change it just for every pastor and saying every pastor needs to do this, we come in and train the whole church. This is it. So we take more of a grassroots view of it to get the churches from the grassroots coming up. And we focus on the smaller churches, not the bigger churches, because quite frankly, most of the bigger churches are already gone woke and they're too far gone.
Only sharing the truth.
Yeah. If any of your listeners haven't figured out that I have some strong views, I'm sorry.
It's good. I think it's important, but there's so much there that you said that was so good. And one of the things that I appreciate is the fact that you have a friend that you completely don't really agree with, but you guys can have that civil conversation and the debate. I love that. I miss that. I miss being able to say, hey, I want to listen to your point of view. Maybe I'll take something from it, but I don't have to agree with you to get along. Right. And that's so important. And for as Christians, actually, there was a message at church our pastor talked about was how to live in an ungodly world and how to be a light. And you have essentially three options. You can condemn, which a lot of Christians do. A lot of Christians are judgmental. You can condone and go the woke way and say, oh, it's okay. You do you. It's all good. But there's another option, and that's compassionate confrontation, where essentially we stand, but you can't just stand. We still got to share the gospel. We still got to share the good news. But the good news is that it's that we're all fallen. And it's not a social justice gospel. It's a gospel of it's a simple gospel. We are sinners. It's not about us. It's what God did for us. And there is forgiveness. And if we are willing, he will forgive. And I think we just forget that, or we get, how can I do that? How can I confront somebody on that? Well, you're confronting with the gospel. You're sharing the gospel, the good news, and people want and need to hear it. They don't need you to condemn them. They need you to bring them along and share Christ with them.
Yeah, look, the gospel's offensive, isn't it?
It is.
It is.
Because it's not about us.
Correct. But we don't have to be offensive. That's the thing I do in my evangelism. I'm trying to say the gospel is offensive, but we got to do everything to be an ambassador for Christ so that we're not offensive. And so the church that I attend is Grace and Truth Bible Church. Why that name? We ended up coming with that name because there's a lot of churches that teach grace and a lot of churches that teach truth, but there's not a lot of churches that teach grace and truth. The Bible says we should have truth and love, right? Mm-hmm. Those go together, but a lot of people think it's one or the other, like they're mutually exclusive. No, the most loving thing that I could do for someone that is getting caught up in social justice is to walk them through very slowly, hearing them out, understanding why they're so involved in it, to hear them out, to understand the issues and educate them on what the Bible says about this. Now, I recognize there's some people, because the way this movement is, there's some people that just won't even hear it. Because once you disagree, you're immediately an enemy. Well, think about that. Read through 1 John and say, is that the way we are supposed to respond within the church? If you don't agree with me, I'm not speaking to you. I hate you. I won't. No. If you don't have love for your brother, 1 John says, we got to call into question whether you're even a brother. Mm-hmm. I mean, a Christian is marked by their love for one another, even those we disagree with. I mean, I say this all the time. You just go to your church and think about it. Just Sunday, each one of you listening, think about this. Go to church on Sunday, look around the congregation and go, if it wasn't for Christ, would I actually be friends with these people? Would I want to do things with these people? What is it that brings us together from vast backgrounds? In most churches, you're going to have some who have money and some who don't. You're going to have some who are educated and some who aren't. You're going to have some that are black and some that are white. And everyone gets along because of Christ. That's what brings us together in a church. It doesn't divide us. Social justice wants to divide us all into our separate groups. And it's interesting to see how, just a sidebar, it's interesting to see how Asian Americans were white. Okay, this is so you can see how quick, folks, think about this and just think about what happens in the news and watch how fast this changes. But they were white. They had white privilege. Why did they have white privilege? Because they're educated. Why? Because their generation after generation focuses on education to get ahead. And so when it came to this idea of white privilege, Asians had white privilege. And so they didn't have intersectionality points that we talked about earlier. Mm-hmm. And then all of a sudden, some guy who they tried making, he's the ideal Christian, because he went to church. Okay. He, really didn't go to church, wasn't really active, he sat in a pew because he grew up there. And so, but he goes in and shoots up these Asians in the massage parlors, which we know were more than massage parlors, because he said why he did. He didn't shoot them because they were Asian. He shot them because he had a pornography addiction, and he was going to those massage parlors and obviously getting something more than a massage. So his motivation wasn't about them being Asian. But 5 minutes before that shooting, all Asians had white privilege. 5 minutes after that shooting, all Asians had intersectionality. Stop Asian hate started spreading. What changed? Well, what changed is that the group of people that are pushing this found a way that they could use something else to cause division and to get people to support their movement. That's what means by useful idiots. Suddenly everyone's like, yes. I mean, do I want to stop Asian hate? Yes, because when COVID started, I would not allow my bride to go shopping on her own. Why? Because people were taking it out on Asians, like just because they're Asian, somehow they caused the virus. Go blame Fauci. He's the one that funded the research, okay? But and by the way, he also benefits from it because he's an owner of Moderna, and he benefits from every vaccine. That should be illegal. He's got a conflict of interest. But the thing that you end up seeing with it is, do I want to see Asian hate stop? Yes. But I don't want to push Marxism as the goal. But see, once they found, now we could use this, then we're going to suddenly change gears, and now we'll use that.
Yes. Marxism is division.
They'll use anything that pushes their agenda.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And they don't care who or what they hurt. That's the thing. It's the agenda that matters. It's not people. And for us, or as believers, we have compassion for people. But because they need to drive their agenda, Christians are hateful. Yeah. And they drive that message, and it's all about division. And isn't it funny that division is the enemy's playground, right? Mm-hmm. He loves division. He is looking at us and going, I can't believe they're falling for it. They are just biting into exactly what I threw at them as bait. And this division, and the more divided we become, the harder it's going to be to come out. And that's really what this is about. It's not about race.
Yeah. Well, yeah, look, the thing is that as Christians, the way we deal with this is with the gospel. We have to first remind ourselves of what the gospel is. Listening to you shared earlier, it's like, as a Christian, do you love hearing that? Do you love hearing the gospel? Do you love hearing what Christ did for us? We have to remind ourselves in the church, this is what Christ did for us. The church is about Christ, what God has done, God's glory. That is our focus. Our focus is on God, not self. Social justice is on self and not God. It replaces God with the God of self. And so what we have to do in the church is remind ourselves the gospel. One of the problems, one of the ways I think that this is snuck into the churches, because not enough people in churches evangelize. Not enough people are sharing the gospel with other people, hearing themselves tell the gospel story over and over and over. I'm an evangelist. Every time I hear it, I get excited. Every time I hear someone sharing the gospel, I get excited because this is what Christ did for me. Every time I share it, I get excited. This is what Christ did for me. It reminds me where I came from. I was an enemy of God to becoming adopted as a child of God. I don't deserve that. The people will say it's Christianity is one beggar telling another beggar where to find bread. This is the gospel. We start with the gospel. Everything should be about the gospel message because that's what unites us as Christians. And so we got to get to that. Okay. Look, you and I were talking, you know that I run about a half marathon a day. I was very upset today. Someone came to my house early. I only got 11 miles in. I had an appointment yesterday. So I have 2 days where I've only done 11-mile runs. And I'm like really not happy with that because I haven't been doing, I call it my daily dozen. I have to do at least 12 miles a day. But I usually with my cool down, I do about 13 and a half miles a day. And so, but the reality is at any point that I just say, you know what, this is hard. I'm just going to stop. I just don't feel like doing it. I mean, trust me, there's a lot of days I feel like not doing it. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I train martial arts. I did karate. I do jujitsu. I always like in most of the dojos I was at, there'd be somewhere up, it would say a black belt is a white belt that never quit. When you train for marathons, I've trained for 4 marathons and have done 0, by the way.
How come?
The closest I've gotten was food poisoning the night before, and that was the worst because I had all the training done. But I have gotten injured or food poisoning, but I have gotten the training in for all of them, which is just really a horrible feeling. I had my shirt and everything, my number, and still, but the reality is that there are some people, I hate these, but I went to church with a guy that literally woke up one morning and ran the New Jersey Marathon, having not run for like any length for 6 months. I'm like, I hate you. It's just, that's wrong.
You do hate those people.
I used to run every day with a guy that he's a pacer for marathons. He goes across the country, does like 4 or 5 marathons a year. And he literally was like, he goes, well, I'm gonna pace set for 4:44 times so I don't have to do any training. And I'm like, I'm hoping to do a 5:20. What do you mean you're not even going to train? It's like you're killing me. So, but the reality is that you're not going to just pick up and do something like that generally. Mm-hmm. We're not going to find people in the church that just go, this is hard. I'm just going to quit. And they're going to be able to move on in the Christian life. The real battle is in the training. If we give up on our brother or sister that are struggling with these things and just go, well, you're just a Marxist, that's it, I'm done with you, then you've lost, not your brother, you. If you're one that says, well, if you don't accept, this, social justice, then I'm done with you, then you've lost, not your brother. See, we as Christians need to work together. That's the key. And what brings us together is the gospel, because none of us deserve it. The whole idea of social justice is the entitlement mentality. I'm entitled to something that you have. You have something I don't have, therefore I'm entitled to it. The gospel message is, I'm entitled to nothing. I deserve absolutely nothing. And God gave me everything. That should humble us. That should get us to realize that, God, whatever you want to do, I will follow. Even if it goes against everything that my culture believes, everything that my upbringing is, or my tribe is saying, whatever it is. When I became a Christian, I knew what was going to be, or I expected what was going to be at stake. The reason I didn't share with my parents or anyone in my family that I became a Christian was because I knew my parents would disown me. When they did find out, which was 2 years later, they went casket shopping. They told me that. Now, something happened in the family. And my father said because of that, they decided they weren't going to do that. My father decided he wasn't going to pay for my education, though, if I was going to continue with this Christianity. And I told him, well, I understand that. That's why I was ROTC. And my father did not want any of his boys being military because he nearly got killed by friendly fire in the military. And so he was very much against having his boys in the military. And so he didn't want me being ROTC. So he agreed to fund my education. But I knew that my relationship with my family was I expected it to be cut off altogether. But it was very tense. And I really didn't have a relationship with my family very much. I had to I would call my parents every week. But there was strain there. There was strain with my siblings. I don't have much in common. We get together. There's not that commonality that I have with Christians in the church. And it really took until it took a fist fight with my father when I tried sharing the gospel with him a couple of years ago. So, at 47, I guess you're still old enough to get punched by your dad. But if people ask me as an evangelist, I'm a street evangelist. So I get up and whatever you think of street evangelist, I'm not that guy, folks. Okay. Whatever you're thinking, if you go up, on YouTube and look for street evangelist or open air preacher, open air evangelist, I'm not that guy. Okay. I like what my friend Greg Kokel says. He says there's only two people in the world he knows that does it well. Ray Comfort on the West Coast, Andrew Rapport on the East. I try to be a good ambassador when doing it. But the thing is that people always ask me, have you ever been hit? And I say, no, only by my mother when I was 18 and my father when I was 47. And that drew even greater strain because it took me that long to try to work up the nerve to really sit down with him. And I wanted to give a clear gospel presentation to him. We'd try to drop seeds type of thing. And it was always shut down. And so I pulled him aside and wanted to talk to him. And yeah, obviously it didn't turn out well. But the interesting thing, by God's providence, a couple of years later, my wife was talking with my dad and just talking about how we had met. And yet one of the things you have to understand is I come from a family of wealth. Okay. I didn't lack for much growing up. So the thing was, here's my dad who gives away to philanthropy, to charities and things like that, more money than most people make in a year. And my wife's talking about how she bought me food, but she didn't give all the context. And I just happened to be walking past, and I just turned to my bride, and I'm like, oh, hey, Dad never knew that I was homeless. And she's like, oh, I wasn't going to share that. And I just kept walking. I didn't think twice of it. My father couldn't sleep. It actually crushed him to realize that because I became a Christian, he saw that the relationship we had was so severed that when I was without money, living in my car, I had a friend who let me stay on their couch, where I had no place to live. I didn't go to him, and he had the resources. And that actually is what got him to break down, where we finally, I was, I guess, like 49, where we finally started to be able to talk. Now, I share all that to say this: we can't give up. We can't sit there and just say, well, if you don't agree with me, whatever side you're on, we just quit on you. We don't win marathons that way. We push ourselves through it as hard as it is. I know your audience, because I know you, and I know that you guys, you talk about training. Mm-hmm. And so your audience understands this. We don't win a race without the training. We just can't give up. We have to keep fighting through this together, even when it's hard, even when we don't want to. That's the thing. The whole purpose for us as Christians is we represent Jesus Christ. We represent God. We're his ambassador. We need to push through with one another to come to terms, not just those who within the church, but even within those that in our culture. We have to remember the people who are pushing social justice, they're not our enemy. They're a mission field.
Yeah.
If your heart doesn't break for them because they're blinded by this stuff, they don't see it. If you see it, good, but they don't see it. You don't sit there and beat them up over it. You lovingly share the gospel with them and let God do the work. Once the Holy Spirit indwells them, he's going to do the work. And so we got to look at this in the long run. We got to look at the long game here. Look at this like a marathon training and say, we got to keep running through this. You're never going to do that marathon without all those long 10-mile, 15-mile, 20-mile runs. You got to get those in, and they're painful. Until you get used to doing them, they're painful. I had someone today that asked me, how do you run half a marathon a day? My answer, one foot in front of the other. So how do we deal with these things within the church and within our culture? One foot in front of the other.
That's so good. And I think that's good news. And it's good news for us to end on, because really it's not about us. It's not about anything that we really can do outside of what God tells us to do. And that's share the gospel with others. And that's sharing our story, just like you just shared your story with us. And I so appreciate you coming on, Andrew, and sharing your story and being able to dive deep into this topic, because it is so important for us. It's important for us to get out there and stand and be compassionate and confrontational in a good, loving manner, so that the good news can be shared, because that's what people are looking for. It's probably why CRT is so prevalent, because people are just searching and they don't even know what they're searching for. So before we wrap up, I'd love for you just to share. I'm going to link some of these things. I'm going to link the statement of social justice in the gospel for viewers in case they want to sign, and your podcast. But can you share best ways for listeners to connect with you?
Yeah, and for folks to understand, there's a lot of pressure on me here today. I'm the first male guest, and the first guest talking about issues like this. I mean, folks, there's pressure here.
You did great.
I typically on my podcast, we have a lot more fun. We're more jovial, but we do have some serious topics that we do. But if people want to get a hold of me, the best is go to strivingforeternity.org. If you want to learn about our podcasts, you can go to christianpodcastcommunity.org. We have a lot of podcasts. I have several on there. I have Andrew Rappaport's Rap Report and Apologetics Live are my two main ones. If people want to get into podcasting, I have So You Want to Be a Podcaster. I have a couple others that we don't do as often, but the best way to get a hold of me is probably Striving for Eternity. If you want to get a hold of me, you want questions, the best thing to do there is come on to apologeticslive.com any Thursday night, 8 to 10 Eastern time. Those are my office hours, open to the public. I can answer any question people have about God and the Bible, because I think I don't know is a perfectly good answer. But people challenge me all the time, but seriously, it's a live show that people can join, ask any questions. We usually have guests to talk about specific topics, and then second hour we bring people in to ask any questions that pop up. And so Striving for Eternity is a great way to find out about me. You'll find out about my books I've written. What do we believe and what do they believe? One is a Christian systematic theology. The other is a systematic theology of the major Western religions. But if we could be helpful to you and your local church, you say, hey, but my church is small. We can't afford to pay you guys to come out. Yep, that's the church we want. We have a weird model, Most churches want church to go. Most ministries want to go to churches that can afford to pay them and have big audiences. We would rather go to small audiences, because that's where we think the battle really needs to be fought, is in the small churches, because they're being neglected. And so if you'd want us to come out and speak, you can just contact us at info@strivingforeternity.org. We have several seminars we could come in and do. So we'd love to help your audience in any way that we can in their learning to disciple others, or be discipled, or get materials to disciple within their churches. So
Awesome.
Thanks for having me, and I hope I passed the test of the first male on the guest.
I love it. First of many. You passed the test. This was great. Thank you so much.
At least we established that if I didn't do well, I can run further than you, maybe, so I can run away from you, and hopefully faster than you, so you don't catch me, because that would be bad.
There you go. Yes, a fellow runner. That's always good. And one who runs a half a marathon a day. I love it. That's more than I run.